Okay, now you can start.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to, if it's all right with you, I will take this screen out of here a little bit, if that's all right. I don't want to be distracted by everybody falling asleep while I continue to talk. So I'm going to do this. Is that all right? Is that going to bother anyone? All right. I should tell you, I don't know if I have a picture of this, but the 24th Michigan Monument, one year when I went there, there was a bee's nest, must have been a wasp's nest in a most embarrassing position of that soldier. You know, I had to look and I'm going, I don't remember that from last time I was here. And sure enough, it wasn't. It's obviously not in this picture here. So, but so. All right, well, let me try not to go on at great length. I want to make sure we don't spend too much time here. But this story starts at 10 a.m. on June 12th, 1889, when hundreds of veterans, state government officials, family, and friends gathered at Gettysburg to memorialize, as they said, in granite, the sacrifices made by upwards of 4,000 Michiganians at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, those days' festivities was a culmination of a campaign that had begun 2 years earlier when the state legislature formed the Michigan Monument Commission and appropriated $20,000 to fashion these permanent memorials for each of the Michigan units at Gettysburg. The 1st, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 16th, and 24th Infantry, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, that's the 1st, 5th, 6th, and 7th Regiments, Battery I, 1st Michigan Artillery, and then elements of the U.S. Sharpshooters. There were 4 Michigan companies there. Each, again, a distinctive monument placed at the unit's primary place of engagement. Byron Pierce, the Grand Rapids dentist and 4-year veteran who'd gone from captain to major general, surviving 5 wounds along the way, welcomed veterans. And then Luther S. Trowbridge, formerly of the 5th Cavalry, traced briefly each of the unit's contributions, but only after castigating the defenders of the institution of slavery, who propelled the nation to the bloody Civil War as he went on. Then the wartime governor, Austin Blair, was there. He would declare that the stone memorials reinforced the idea that Michiganians who had struggled on that field fought in a cause that was wholly right. Now, he went on to say, as you can see on the slide, we could admire the courage the rebels offered in the battle, but their cause we could never admire. Blair viewed the Gettysburg battlefield, in his words now, as a shrine to which the patriotic and brave will come as we do to pay homage to those who won the turning victory of the war and saved the Republic for all time, unquote. And while the veterans would pass on, Blair hoped that the enduring testimonials dedicated to their heroic sacrifices would never be permitted to fall into ruin, which I think is probably a safe bet, right? Now, as I tell my students, and I get a chance to go to Gettysburg every spring with the senior MSU ROTC cadets, we do a staff ride. So I do a little background. I'm not going to do a lot of that here because everybody here knows things, but knows the background. But, you know, keeping in mind here, another famous picture of the 7th Michigan crossing the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg. But the North had not had a lot of meaningful victories in the first 2 years, as we well know. And Lee's choices, right? He could have sent troops west. Invading the North is obviously his plan. Doing nothing is not in Lee's character, certainly. And then there were the reasoning, you know, the military opportunities. We all know the generals who he has bested time and again. His greatest victory at Chancellorsville, certainly. The political issues. There was some growth of pacifism, particular places like maybe New York City with the draft riots that would be coming on later that summer, or even the New Jersey legislature, curiously enough, talking about pacifism as well. And then all those lingering hopes that maybe the British or the French, and again, the French don't move without the British, might somehow recognize the Confederacy. Again, I phrase it as lingering hopes, clearly. And then as the cadets need to understand, or my students, again, the changes in that army, Stonewall is now gone and replaced by these guys here who have performed remarkably well at a division level, but would they perform at the corps level as well? And then, as we all know, while he's not a Virginian, which again, people like Jubal Earl will hold against him for the rest of his life, he is Lee's old warhorse. He's not eager to have the offensive fight that's going to take place at Gettysburg, certainly. And then on the other side, the new commander, right? George Meade, Pennsylvanian. You like his quote there about when he actually didn't want the command. I have tried and condemned. I have been tried and condemned without a hearing, and I shall have to go to the execution. That's the appointment as Army commander, right? So, all right, Lee's invasion. So we're going to cross the Potomac and move on. The Michigan story at Gettysburg really began with long days of hard marching as the Army of the Potomac would chase Lee's rebels from Virginia into Maryland. Sweltering mid-June temperatures, which would take a frightening toll. You see some of the quotes here from some of the Michigan soldiers. There was Edward Clark of the 3rd Michigan who recorded, "Our corps lost nearly 100 men from sunstroke." Dr. Cyrus Bacon, he's from southwestern Michigan. He's a 5th Corps surgeon. He would agonize in his diary, "Men fall down with sunstroke in the road. I can give them brandy and leave them, for there is no ambulance to put them in." Or one comrade's diary, the entry simply read, "Hot, hot, hot." And water was fairly scarce, and even finding it proved, maybe a blessing. At one watering hole, a Livingston County infantryman explained, quote, "We poked the scum one side with our cups and then gave the water a spat to scare the bugs and wigglers to the bottom, and then filled our canteens." Now, despite some of those wretched conditions, traveling through Northern Virginia in particular, offered new foraging expeditions. Matter of fact, the men in one Michigan regiment said they lived, quote, "in good style with the boys bringing in an abundance of chicken, geese, pigs, mutton, milk, butter, honey." Now, sometimes that foraging backfired. When the 4th Michigan passed a mill, their thoughts turned to gravy, so they had purchased a cup of flour, or so they thought. Well, they finally discovered that flour was really plaster of Paris. Bivouac nearby, these angry Yankees first thought about burning down the mill, and then they reconsidered and they just went back and they stole all the beehives from that particular miller, right? But crossing into Maryland and made a big difference, a refreshing change. Again, having experienced nothing, according to one Detroiter, nothing but sour-looking people in Virginia, they were overjoyed. "We are at last out of the enemy's country and where we can see smiling faces when we march along the roads." One Livingston County soldier again said, Marylanders, quote, "were on the porch waving the stars and stripes and singing the Star-Spangled Banner, made us forget our tired limbs and sore feet for a while." For 23-year-old Sergeant Charles McConnell, who explained to his mother, "The difference between our reception here and in Virginia is most gratifying. Here the people greet us like human beings, sympathize with us, sell us everything at almost no price at all, and treat us as loyal people should treat the defenders of their homes and firesides." Now that was in Maryland. And again, there is a bit of a difference when we get to Pennsylvania. Again, the Pennsylvanians demanded, in the eyes of some Michiganians, big prices for everything they had. Matter of fact, $1 for a loaf of bread. And even though Captain James Kidd of the Cavalry Brigade talked about the snow white bread smeared thick with the delicious apple butter was wonderful, but you had to have $1 to get it. Or General Alpheus S. Williams, grumbling about Southern Pennsylvanians, full of copperheads, he would write. Copperheads who are rich, but ignorant of everything beyond their small spears. The Dutch barns, which he compared to great arsenals, were impressive, he said, but altogether these are people of barns, not brains. Matter of fact, the Detroiter also expressed frustration with these, what he described as stupidly ignorant people whose, quote, timid imaginations, unquote, feared a 1,000,000-man rebel army possessing, quote, thousands of pieces of artillery invading their home state. Now, there was certainly reasons for some confidence. One Michigan infantryman insisted, "We are ready to meet the enemy with a confident and determined and dedicated spirit." This particular 19-year-old in the 24th Michigan would say, "We all think that the rebels are making a move that will ruin them. It will be the death of the rebellion." On the other hand, though, General Williams again confiding in late June, "I am full of faith and yet fearfully anxious. We run a fearful risk because upon this small army, everything depends." Well, we know that Meade, when he took command, had a plan that doesn't happen, right? The Pipe Creek defensive plan. And you can see how that plays out or didn't play out, as it were. And then, as we know, the move to Gettysburg, the roads that are important as bringing all the troops in from the north and from the south. On June 30th, Private John Ryder will predict, "I expect we will have a great battle shortly," unquote. Now, Ryder was praised by his commander as a first-rate soldier. He's 20 years old. He's from Plymouth, as you well know, adding that if battle has got to be done, this is what he's writing his parents, "let it come, and we will look for the best." More to a point, a Dearborn comrade hoped, "It must be our turn to make them run this time," unquote. Well, the battle, as we know, starts to the west. Buford and his cavalrymen, on the morning when they are defending that part of the town west of Gettysburg, the 24th Michigan will finishing their breakfast, a breakfast of coffee, hardtack, and salt pork, preparing to march. They are several miles south of Gettysburg. At the same time, Chaplain Way is leading the men into prayer. Okay. And the Iron Brigade, of which the 24th Michigan is part of, the band will strike up, "The Campbells Are Coming." The men above the music will hear the dull boom of artillery, the crackling of carbines, as Buford's his outnumbered brigades certainly are slowing up the rebels. At the Cadore House, which you can see on the map there, about a mile south of Gettysburg, the Iron Brigade will leave the Emmitsburg pike and hasten towards the sound of battle. Colonel Morrow had hoped to halt his men to load their rifles, but the urgency forced them to load on the run, and that's a task reserved for veterans, certainly. And when the brigade reached Seminary Ridge, they crashed into the unsuspecting rebels. These were stunned Tennesseans and Alabamians of James Archer's brigade. They were reeled as volleys were exchanged at a range of 40 yards. Again, the Black Hats, as we well know, matter of fact, according to legend, this is well known to all of you. The Confederates declared, those are those damned Black Hat fellows, tain't no militia, it's the Army of the Potomac. And within minutes, many shocked rebels threw down their rifles and surrendered. Others fled. You're familiar with Abel Peck. He was one of a handful of 24th Michigan color bearers. He is among the first Michiganians to die in the fight there on July 1st, as they routed the Archer's brigade and took General Archer, prisoner. Now, the Iron Brigade withdrew to McPherson's Woods, and as the arrival of more troops stretched along, the battle continues. The 24th Michigan is in an awkward salient in the center of the brigade's line. Matter of fact, the Colonel Morrow, will ask repeatedly if he might be able to move from that position. He is told each time the position must be held. Later in the afternoon, as the battle intensifies along the Union right flank, fresh Southern brigades, again advancing, yelling like demons, will cross the Willoughby Run. Morrow will give the order to fire, and there's a solid sheet of flame stopping the rebels, but only temporarily. They reform, and the regiment begins to start taking some heavy casualties. Matter of fact, ultimately, the 19th Indiana will collapse to the immediate left flank of the 24th Michigan, creating a real problem. And some of these lines are within 20 yards of each other as they're fighting. At one point, as you can see in the painting here, Colonel Morrow seizes the flag. A 22-year-old William Kelly will grab the colors, insisting the colonel of the 24th shall never carry the flag while I am alive. Kelly was instantly killed. At one point, the colors were found cradled in the arms of an unidentified soldier who in death had somehow kept the flag upright. Morrow goes down, Minnie Ball creases his skull, not serious wounded as it turns out. Captain Albert Edwards, who originally had started his military career with the 1st Michigan Infantry at First Bull Run, will lead the remnants of the 24th through the chaotic streets of Gettysburg, past the Lutheran Seminary there. The next morning, the 27-year-old from Adrian will rally the fewer than 100 survivors at that point. As a University of Michigan English major, he will issue his first order, and he will talk about congratulating his brave soldiers for their splendid achievement. Some of the men who, again, in this particular slide, who don't survive that day: Gilbert Dickey, one of the first graduates of the Michigan Agricultural College, as it was called then. Matter of fact, according to Colonel Morrow, he will describe him as a man of great promise for future usefulness and distinction. So be it. Captain William Speed of Detroit was described by Colonel Morrow as amiable, intelligent, honorable, and brave, and universally respected and esteemed by all who knew him. Colonel Morrow will be taken temporary prisoner, or a short time prisoner, I should say, briefly held. Then he will have a chase encounter with the Confederate General Richard Ewell. And when the rebel corps commander asked the Detroiter why his men had not laid down their arms rather than be slaughtered, again, 80% casualties, as you well know, Morrow snapped back, the 24th Michigan came here to fight, not to surrender. And again, our 24th Michigan monument and the dedication day, the flags, which, as you well know, are in the Michigan Historical Center today, used to be in the Capitol, which was a terrible place for them. Those are all reproductions that are there. Now, there is a monument to the 24th, naturally, but there is not a monument to this Michiganian, Henry Baxter, a native New Yorker whose family had settled in Jonesville, Michigan during the 1830s. The then teenage Baxter had ventured to California to strike it rich. He returned home having failed. He entered the milling trade, he married, he started a family, and with the outbreak of the war, as a prominent, thriving businessman, he raised a company, the Jonesville Light Guard, later Company C, 7th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. Captain Baker's gritty, upfront style of leadership will earn him promotions, so that by the February of 1863, having suffered his 3rd battlefield wound, he is now a brigadier general. He is commanding the 2nd Brigade, 2nd Division, 1st Corps. It's about 1,500 men, 6 veteran regiments who have now serving together for the first time. His brigade will arrive at the seminary there about noon, following a 7-mile march, quickly moving to the right of the Union line. And over the course of the next several hours, Baxter's men faced elements of the 8,000-man rebel division led by General Robert Rhodes. Again, Baxter directing his men in what was described as several complicated changes of front during the fire and in a timely manner. Matter of fact, at one point, he was bellowing, "Up, boys, and give them the steel." And the 41-year-old, led 3 regiments in a charge that netted 400 prisoners and 3 flags, as it were. He will survive. Matter of fact, his brigade is going to run out of ammunition and ultimately pull back. The balance of the fight, as it turns out, is not only is he's continued to, doesn't see a prominent role in the last 2 days, but his brigade will suffer about 50% casualties. No monument to Baxter, certainly, to my knowledge, anywhere, as it turns out. But the retreat, though, and this is where I bring Major Edwards back into the picture, back to East Cemetery Hill, which is the high point, certainly a key point in the battlefield, as you well know. And this is where the 24th Michigan, the rest of the Iron Brigade will spend. And they will see some action during the course of the next 2 days. Again, lots of cannon. I'm doing a presentation right now, preparing a presentation, I should say, on artillery at Gettysburg, upwards of 35, 40 guns on this prominent hill. So day 2, okay, a day, as Catton says, in which crisis followed crisis. So on the morning of July 2nd, well, the plan, I should say, let me go back to this first. The plan, and in keeping in mind what I share with my cadets at von Moltke's comment about battle plans, right? This was Lee's plan, that they would be able to attack the exposed left flank, or seemingly exposed left flank of the Union Army. Longstreet not overly excited about it, as we well know, but it doesn't turn out that way, and partly because of this guy right here, Dan Sickles, right? Dan Sickles, disliking the position he had, moves his troops out, as it were. And he had some good reason to be concerned, certainly. Now, the area about a mile west of his position on Cemetery Ridge was a wooded area. There also was a slightly higher area where the peach orchard is, as you may know, only about 40 feet or so, not really all that significantly higher. But he also was concerned that his flank was going to be exposed, and the Union cavalry, which isn't in this particular picture, had been removed, which prompts him to make his plan to go ahead and move forward without really, I mean, he kind of let Meade know, as we well understand. I mean, it wasn't Meade's idea by any stretch to let this happen. But the man, and this is the Michigan presentation, Hiram Berdan. Berdan, before this movement takes place, will lead a reconnaissance mission into the Pitzer Woods. Now, he is a native New Yorker, raised in Michigan, and organized in his special cadre of sharpshooters who won all kinds of laurels for their marksmanship. I mean, this guy actually, Berdan, was an exceptionally good marksman in his own right. The problem as an officer in the war is he earned a dubious reputation for seldom wanting to be on the firing line. Whenever the sharpshooters were involved in fighting, seemingly, there was something in the rear that Berdan had to go check on. Now, in the case of the Pitzer Woods, he will lead 3 sharpshooter companies, including one of those companies. There are 4 of them in the 1st and 2nd U.S. sharpshooters, but one of those Michigan companies will be with Berdan, along with some Maine infantrymen who will go into the Pitzer Woods, and they will actually have an intense 20-minute firefight before he pulls back, and he goes to, ultimately to Sickles, is who gets the word. Yes, I have seen Lee's troops. That's going to prompt Sickles, a very nervous Sickles, confirming his worst fears, to advance his corps. Again, the reality is that that wasn't really what was taking place. But the point being is that the 3rd Corps will move out there. The 1st and 2nd U.S. sharpshooters are part of the 3rd Corps. One of those companies will ultimately be sent over to Big Round Top, and they will be described, according to one historian, as day savers by delaying a considerably larger rebel force that was moving towards Big Round Top. Okay, that's the 2nd sharpshooters, as it were. I do point out to my cadets that Dan Sickles, who, as we know, survives despite the loss of his leg. And I don't know if any of you have by chance, I had a chance a few years ago to visit his leg bone, excuse me, which is at the U.S. Army Medical Museum in suburban Washington, D.C. Okay. In the Peach Orchard, we've got the 3rd Michigan. And the 3rd Michigan here, part of a brigade that included the 5th Michigan, commanded by Colonel Regis de Trobriand, a native Frenchman who had immigrated to the United States years earlier. And for all the misery encountered marching north, the 3rd Michigan apparently enjoyed a few perks in the days before the battle. They exchanged their very detested Austrian rifles for Enfields, received 2 months back pay, as well as much needed new brogans. Okay. So The 3rd Michigan will engage the enemy around the Rose Farm, sometimes at a range of not over 50 yards, according to their after-action report, repulsing the rebels with heavy losses. Their second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pierce, the brother of Byron, boasted his men fought with a desperation never before witnessed, unquote. They would ultimately retire in good order late on the 2nd day. Colonel Byron Pierce apparently remained mounted, cheering his men along the skirmish line until he was wounded, his 3rd wound, again, of 5. The 5th Michigan had an equally challenging day, as it turns out. Matter of fact, the bullets, according to their after-action report, were coming in very thick and fast. And after 2 hours of intense fighting with muskets, quote, so heated they were useless, unquote, the men were scrounging ammunition from the fallen. The 5th would withdraw. One 5th Michigan officer would say it was the hardest fight he had ever seen. They reported losses of 105 men out of the 250 men. Their twice wounded colonel, John Pulford, and 10 of the regiment's 14 officers went down. You might be familiar with Daniel Crody's post-war memoir. Again, a interesting, not the best, but certainly often quoted, as it turns out. The 1st Michigan Monument, or the 1st Michigan Regiment, I should say, brigaded with the 4th among the 5th Corps reinforcements sent to bolster Sickles' overwhelmed command. Now, the 1st Michigan was no sooner moved into position east of the Peach Orchard when the rebel skirmishers appeared within 200 yards. Their colonel, Ira Abbott of Burr Oak, which most people don't know about, but it's in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula, fell wounded early in the fighting. He was replaced by the lieutenant colonel, you're looking at him right there, William Trope. He will say that his regiment fought with a deadly effect, and when the rebels returned, we drove them back with great loss. Though facing a storm of bullets, he would compliment his men for firing as coolly as though on drill, unquote. He would claim that the 62 dead rebels lying on his front, I'm not exactly sure when he counted all these guys, proved men never behaved more gallantly than the soldiers of the 1st Michigan in this battle. Now, the situation proved considerably different for the 4th Michigan Infantry, which crossed into Pennsylvania in the afternoon of July 1st. Now, Colonel Harrison Jeffords halted his regiment and reminded them, quote, you are now standing on free soil once more. And his men responded with cheers. Later that day, Jeffords' weary command enjoyed a glorious reception from the residents of Hanover, who greeted them with sandwiches and cold water. Before daylight the next morning, the 4th, along with the entire 1st Division, marched a few miles to Gettysburg. After spending much of the morning shifting from one position to another, Jeffords' men reached the wheat field around 5 p.m. As the 4th entered the wheat field, one infantryman noted that there were a lot of wounded Yankees passing through our ranks headed to the rear. That was understandably disturbing. And as the fighting swirled back and forth over the blood-soaked ground, the rebels, quote, came in with yells and flanked the 4th with deadly, effective surprise and force. Private James Houghton later recalled, our good old regiment was now in a critical situation. There were only 2 things for us to do. That was to surrender or to pass out directly in front of their lines and receive the contents of their well-loaded rifles. Well, Colonel Jeffords ordered a change of front to meet the threat, but with the rebels coming in, quote, on all sides of us, unquote, and then facing a storm of lead sweeping through the ranks, the 4th was overwhelmed. And it was, as one survivor said, every man for himself. Hand-to-hand combat, the regiment's color guard was decimated, and the U.S. flag fell into enemy hands. Now, this is de Trobriand's painting of the 4th Michigan in the wheat field. Colonel Jeffords, accompanied by 2 other lieutenants, rushing forward to grab the flag. The Jeffords does not survive. You can see the one rebel there about to bayonet him. He will be mortally wounded. The two officers that went with him were seriously wounded, but they both survived. Again, this is a regiment that went into the fight with 342 men and suffered about 50% casualties, helping the badly injured captain to an aid station. One Michigan private remembered, quote, the pools of blood along the road where the poor fellows had stopped and a few moments to rest. So with darkness and a brutal afternoon having ended for those four regiments, they didn't really see any more fighting in the immediate days fighting. There is another Michiganian who does not have a monument and probably deserves one certainly, and this would be Annie Etheridge, or Anna Etheridge as she was born. She is a remarkable Michiganian. She's been serving in the Army of the Potomac the entire war. Born in Detroit in 1839, she went to war with the 2nd Michigan Infantry. When the regiment moved west, 2nd that is, our Annie, as the soldiers knew her, decided to transfer to the 3rd Michigan Infantry. And possessing, quote, a vigorous constitution and decidedly good looking, unquote. That's a contemporary observation, not a historian's observation. Annie ministered to the wounded on numerous battlefields, sometimes in the thick of fighting. General David Birney will award her the Kearney Cross. General Phil Kearney had decided he wanted to give her this medal, which he introduced. He was going to actually promote her to sergeant, but he did not survive the fight before that was done. But the entire division was drawn up, and she was presented that medal, which she has there wearing right there. One soldier remembering on the battlefield now, Annie moving softly amongst the wounded, kneeling upon the ground beside them and tenderly bathing and dressing their wounds. Her low woman's voice was music to their ears, and her kind words of sympathy and encouragement seemed almost angelic to the sufferers. Her presence alone was of incalculable benefit. She filled a place there that no man can fill. And these comments about Annie don't just come from Michigan men. They came from other accounts that witnessed her actions both here and in subsequent battles. She certainly earned, and she wasn't paid, by the way, if you're wondering. Then there's the 16th Michigan. Private Alfred Atep of the 16th Michigan entered Pennsylvania on the afternoon of July 1st. Drum beating and flags were flying, and the brigade commander, Colonel Strong Vincent, ordered a martial display to buoy the spirits of the men, and it apparently worked. John Barry of the 16th Michigan will record in his diary, "We march in better spirits, although footsore and worn out with the late long marches and want of natural rest. We hurry along singing as if we are in a pleasure excursion." A Genesee infantryman added, "The music, the flags, the cheers, even the grateful Pennsylvanians made, quote, many a tired soldier trod with a firmer step and renewed again his determination to fight as he had never fought before." And again, they passed through Hanover, and the Yankees, they saw some of the previous day's cavalry fight, but in less than 24 hours, this regiment would be actively involved. Now, the 16th headed to Gettysburg, commanded by a 26-year-old, a Lieutenant Colonel Norvell E. Welch. This is the face of Little Round Top, where the 16th Michigan will deal with the rebels on the afternoon of the 2nd day. Let me get to a picture of Norvell Welch here. He's a 2-year veteran, described by one sergeant as a good officer who attends to his duties, looking after the welfare of the men, and is sociable with them all. They will arrive a few miles outside of Gettysburg in the middle of the night, and that's after a 22-mile march. They will be shifted back and forth during the course of the afternoon, and by mid-afternoon on the 2nd day, Colonel Vincent's brigade will move by the double quick to occupy the then undefended Little Round Top. A lawyer and former Harvard professor, Vincent skillfully deploys his men on the southern and western slopes down from the summit, reasoning that if he kept his men on the crest of Little Round Top, the rebels might turn the flank or fall in his rear. Initially, the 16th Michigan and you don't see it in this map here, was which was, by the way, the brigade's smallest regiment, was placed on the brigade's far left. There was a decision to change it, but two of the largest companies of the 16th Michigan were sent out as skirmishers, and they never came with the regiment when it was shifted over to the far right of the brigade. Okay. Unlike the other regiments in the brigade, apparently the 16th not only lacked the outcroppings of rocks and boulders for good cover, but on the western slope of Little Round Top, it was a little more gradual, and the rocks provided less cover for the attack, or more cover for the attackers, the rebels coming up. Okay. Well, they got there just in time, because Lieutenant Charles Salter will recall, if we had been 5 minutes later, the enemy would have gained the ridge and that we were on, and it would have been very hard to drive them off. So you have another Trobriand painting here of the 16th Michigan. Again, as the Lieutenant Salter will point out, we never had such a terrible close bayonet fight before. It seemed as if every man on both sides was actuated by the intensest hate and determined to kill as many of the enemy as possible. Now, at a crucial moment, about 40 members of the 16th Michigan, including Lieutenant Colonel Welch, and the regiment's flag, that's key to this, withdrew from the battle line. Seeing his right flank disintegrating, this is where Colonel Vincent races to the 16th position, mounting a large rock, trying to implore the other Michiganians to hold. This is where he is mortally wounded, as is his aide-de-camp, who was a 20-year-old from Saginaw. Chaos threatened. Along comes the 140th New York, a huge regiment, as you well know, commanded by Colonel Patrick O'Rourke, which will stabilize the Michigan position, as it turns out. As darkness neared, the 16th Michigan survivors would slump down exhausted. Here is our monument, thanking God that we had been spared. You can see one comment there from Lieutenant Ziba Graham, weary, exhausted, but the position had been held. The captured rebels during the fight on Little Round Top admitted that they, according to Lieutenant Salter, never been repulsed in any charge they had made before. That's their quote. And the 23-year-old Salter will casually gloat in his letter, the reason was simple enough. They had never encountered our corps on the battlefield, or else they would know better than to think of charging upon us. Now, Salter could brag, but Norval Welch faced serious criticism for not only having abandoned his regiment in the heat of battle, but maybe contributing to a near disaster on Little Round Top. In his after-action report, Welch blamed a junior officer for removing the regiment's colors, which he claimed resulted, quote, from some misconstruction of orders and entirely unwarrantable assumption of authority, unquote. Welch ignored in his after-action report why he accompanied the flag. Well, after the war, Oliver Norton, the brigade's bugler, found, as a matter of fact, he apparently did find Welch nearly a mile in the rear. He rejected that explanation. Now, historians have been a lot kinder, although one noted, quote, the entire matter was officially covered up, unquote. Historian Edwin Coddington, who you're familiar with, said the young lieutenant colonel, quote, was having a bad day, unquote, attributing his actions to, quote, a misunderstanding. More recently, regimental historians have acknowledged the actions that Welch did not come close to telling the truth about what had happened. Maybe he was a victim of the confusion of battle. Whatever it may have been, Welch will take an unexplained several-month sick leave of absence. He returns to the 16th, but those events on Little Round Top are going to haunt him, may have contributed to his heroic action the following year that led to his death on a Virginia battlefield. Now, as the fighting intensified in places, I should show this one, and you will appreciate this. We have to show the Michiganian Jeff Daniels, despite the mustache and the role that he played in a good movie that we've all watched many times, right? The sharpshooters are also, and on the face of Little Round Top is the Sharpshooter Monument. 4 companies, 3 in the first U.S. sharpshooters, 1 in the second, dressed in green, as you well know, and the role they played. And again, a couple of the second U.S. sharpshooter companies playing an important role in Big Round Top. Ultimately, the first sharpshooters over, again, closer to the peach orchard. So as the fighting subsided on Little Round Top and Wheatfield, there was still some additional fighting that takes place elsewhere. And just real quickly, you've got some fighting that takes place on the second day. You've got Norman Hall in particular. Let me do this first so that I'll do Culp's Hill first, because that's in the second half. And the reason I bring up Culp's Hill is the 24th Michigan did see a little bit of fighting in fighting in the afternoon and evening of the second into the third. Here is again Culp's Hill from Cemetery Hill. Give you an idea of where some of the areas. There's a small monument to the 24th Michigan in that vicinity, reminding us where they were located. And then this is the Culp's Hill. And more important isn't so much from a Michigan perspective that takes place here, as rather what's missing. General Williams is simply not given the due. I mean, there's no Michigan units, as you know, that serve in the 12th Corps, but Williams is serving as a temporary commander of the 12th Corps, and he will take a division over to fighting that's taking place in the Wheatfield. Then he will come back. Ultimately, he will, old Pap, as it were, will meet with the other generals in the Meade's headquarters, in which he will simply say, yes, we need to stay here, as it turns out. The disappointment that I've got from a Michigan perspective is that the 12th Corps really does a great job, and Williams is back on the hill in the middle of the night of the second, moving into the third, and he will play an important role in reinforcing that position and resisting the Confederates. And he doesn't get any recognition. Yes, you look to the fact that there's a Williams Avenue, but there's not even any cannon on Williams Avenue, let alone monuments. So I always thought, well, this is really not fair. And then ultimately, historians look upon the important role that Williams played. The overlooked defense of Culp's Hill, according to historian Coddington, gives Williams great credit. Matter of fact, he says the defense there was superb. That's a quote. He claims it's Williams' finest hour in the war. And sadly, too much of that Detroiter's role at Gettysburg goes unrecognized and unrewarded, as Coddington will point out. Even in the after-action report, Meade will snub the 12th Corps. And that causes a real problem as well. There were some factual inaccuracies that irritated Williams. He even talked about resigning. Maybe it was fortunate that he was sent west. So, all right, that said, the rest of the fight moves to the third day. The copse of trees. I always have to remind my students that we're talking about copse, not corpse of trees. There had been some fighting, certainly, with in particular, the 7th Michigan. Okay. And the 7th Michigan will be to the immediate south of the copse of trees. There's also an important role that, here we go, the copse of trees, Norman Hall's brigade. Matter of fact, let me do this. Let me go to Norman Hall's brigade first, and I'll come back here in a second to the artillery. Norman Hall is a West Pointer. Okay, his family had migrated from New York to Monroe County during the late 1840s. He'd entered the military academy in 1854, and following graduation, he was assigned to Fort Moultrie at Charleston, South Carolina. The newly dubbed second lieutenant's responsibilities included more than just being an artillery officer. Apparently, when Major Robert Anderson abandoned Moultrie in favor of nearby Fort Sumter, Hall assembled the necessary provisions for the soon-to-be famous fort. Equally important, Hall met with Southern representatives, often at great personal risk from unruly mobs, as Major Anderson's representative in negotiating the fort's destiny. So when the war broke out, or when the fighting broke out at Fort Sumter, excuse me, apparently Hall braved Southern shell to assist in raising the fort's fallen flagstaff. And this is what he had to say about that experience. A mixture of pride, pain, sorrow, pleasure. Now, after the war started in earnest, Hall was temporarily returned to artillery before he went to the engineers. And then by mid-July of 1862, now newly promoted colonel, assuming command of the 7th Michigan, which came from southeastern part of the Lower Peninsula anyway. At Fredericksburg, at Chancellorsville, Hall and his men earned accolades. He's now elevated to brigade command. So he's brigade command at Fredericksburg as well as Chancellorsville. But he's got really delicate health. And that is going to worsen. Bouts of typhoid, sunstroke, digestive miseries, as it were, is going to leave him pretty physically exhausted. He never relinquished command, but by the spring of 1863, he was campaigning actually from an ambulance. So his 900-man brigade endured the difficult march north. We won't go into any more detail about that. But then they would be positioned just south of the copse of trees. The 7th Michigan and the 59th New York manning the front line, dismantling a rail fence and hastily constructing what one Michigan infantryman said was a sort of barricade. This is on the late afternoon of the 2nd of July, because here comes the remains of Longstreet's attack. A Confederate battery actually overrun, Confederate infantrymen overrun a Yankee battery, as it turns out, and there is some hot fighting that takes place there during the course of that late afternoon, early evening. The major of the 7th Michigan will note that during the hottest of the firing, many rebels threw down their weapons and crept into Yankee lines. Those who did not surrender retreated in considerable disorder. One of the things that happened there that came as a real annoyance, one of the flags, and again, capturing a flag was the ultimate demonstration of heroism on a battlefield. There was a Confederate flag that the 7th Michigan should have captured, except somebody else came along and took it, right? Well, here is where Hall's brigade is located, the 7th Michigan, during the course of the afternoon of the 2nd and then into the day of the 3rd. Okay. So throughout the night of July 2nd, Colonel Hall's men, despite lacking any tools, matter of fact, anywhere you read about the brigade, they talk about having a shovel, apparently. But nevertheless, they're piling up rails and stones and sticks and boards. The next morning, as that sun beat down, blankets or shelter halves were used to create crude sunscreens. According to one member of the 7th Michigan, there was no hilarity, no joking, no laughing, and in many cases you could see good Christian boys praying, and in this manner we waited calmly either for death or victory. He wrote that after the fact, actually. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, this particular Private Osterly, and his fellow Yankees on Cemetery Ridge were jarred out of that lazy summer stupor as those 150 rebel cannon began pouring shot and shell onto Cemetery Ridge. One Michigan private remembered, "We hugged the ground and how we stuck our heads as much as possible of our body out of the way of these merciless approaching and bounding shells." Now, Colonel Hall, experiencing what he described as the terrible grandeur of the rain of missiles and the chaos of strange and terror-spreading sounds. This 2-hour barrage, so there's some speculate it wasn't quite that long. Then, as we know, followed by the rebel advance, which Hall will describe as fearfully irresistible. But before I do that, let me go back to my artillerymen, because it's not fair to ignore them. I think they're a little bit out of position. But there are a number of good Michigan stories that come out of this, out of Gettysburg, not the least of which is this man right here, Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt is, as impressive an artilleryman as either side. You can see what one rebel general had to say here. He is a West Pointer. His grandfather actually began the family's lengthy Army career at Lexington Green in April of 1775. Now, Hunt's father went to the military academy, but he dropped out. And then he entered the Army as a lieutenant. And while he was stationed at Detroit Barracks, Henry was born in 1819. Reassignment will move the Hunt family to Jefferson Barracks at St. Louis, and then on to Fort Leavenworth. Disease will will take the mother and father of Henry Hunt. He will, at the age of 10, he becomes an orphan. He does enter West Point 6 years later. He enters the artillery, which is exactly where he needed to be when he graduates. He saw fighting in Mexico City. And then in the post-Mexican War now, he will be the co-author of the Army's revised tactical manual on light artillery. Okay, Gettysburg, according to Hunt's biographer, and I really like this picture in the inset as much as I like the one standing up, but Edward Longacre is the biographer of Henry Hunt. He will say this is the pinnacle of Henry Hunt's illustrious career. In the early morning darkness of July 2nd, he will arrive at Gettysburg, immediately focusing on the command that included 67 batteries, that's 372 guns, 8,000 men, 7,000 horses. If we had more time, I could go into greater detail. I won't do that, but he will spend the second day of intense fighting, moving all along the Union line, and then at night, moving prior to the July 3rd fight, replacing damaged guns, filling caissons, readying his reserve guns for another day. He's got, each corps has a brigade of batteries, and then there's some reserve batteries as well. He will order his gunners to be careful with them. And one of his pet peeves, if you will, was the need to conserve ammunition. In fact, pointing out that each round costs somewhere about $3 each, so that you needed to be careful how much you spent, as it were. During the bombardment, he will play an important role, not only ultimately moving, quieting the guns, but he's going to run into a real problem. And the real problem, as you well know, might have to do with General Hancock, who wants his Second Corps gunners to keep firing. And Hunt says, no, there's going to be an infantry attack after this bombardment, so let's reserve our long range our ammunition, and the Second Corps gunners will take a real pounding because they are forced to adhere to a 2 stars order to keep firing, as it were. One of the reserve batteries that's going to come into play, which has a Michigan connection, is this one right here. This is near the Pennsylvania Memorial, and it has been organized months earlier and curiously was sent east. All Michigan artillery batteries, and there were a total of 14 during the course of the war, will be sent to the west, with the exception of Battery I, who will only be in the east for the Battle of Gettysburg and then sent west as well. His novice gunners in their first major fight will perform according to the Captain Jabez Daniels of Hudson with coolness and bravery. They will throw 320 some rounds from their 6-inch ordnance rifles. They're not the Parrott guns that you're looking at the memorial here. Ultimately, during the course of the fighting of the afternoon of the 3rd day. And then there is George Woodruff. George Woodruff, again, one of my fascinating individuals here. George Woodruff is from Marshall. He was nicknamed Little Dad at West Point because he only stood 5'2.5" 2½ inches tall. 5'2.5" inches. 5'2.5" inches. Sorry. His classmates in the graduating class of June of 1861 included Patrick O'Rourke of the 140th New York and Little Round Top fame, Alonzo Cushing, who does not survive the battle and earns a Medal of Honor recently, right? And George Custer. These are Woodruff's guns. He will see a lot of action prior to Gettysburg, the Peninsula, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. But on July 3rd, Battery I, part of the 2nd Corps, was posted at Ziegler's Grove at the north end of the Cemetery Ridge. Again, taking a pounding. I have circled the Virginia Memorial in the distance there, and he will exhaust all his long-range ammunition, as it turns out, when he will pull his guns back, and then when the infantry attack begins, the Confederate infantry attack, he'll pull his guns back up there as Napoleon's, and he will be firing canister, reaching the Confederates at 400 yards, the Emmitsburg pike, which you can see out there at the fence line. He will not survive the battle. Matter of fact, he will be the only member of his battery to die. So moving past all of this, the 7th Michigan, Colonel Amos Steele of Mason, that's suburban Lansing if you're not familiar with Mason, will be killed in the fight here. Hall will take his brigade and they will move towards the copse of trees and the high water mark, as it were. There is, let me go back one here to this slide. Sam Hodgman was a favorite of mine. Sam Hodgman was a Michiganian. He was 30 years old, from Climax, that's near Battle Creek. He didn't think he could get into the war. He thought the war was going to end before he got into it. Well, as it turns out, he will see plenty of fighting on the peninsula, at Antietam, and then also here at Gettysburg. And you can talk about, he's got some great letters, stuck to our barricades and fought till what was left of them, you know, they either skedaddled or surrendered. And again, the 7th Michigan, the new commander is Major Curtis, as it were, and this is the 7th Michigan Memorial. Kemper's brigade will pass right, their flank will pass right in front of the 7th Michigan position. And Colonel Hall will play an important role in the fight as well. As I point out, as you well know, there are another 2 Michiganians, the Byrd brothers, who happened to get into the cyclorama painting, happened to be in the right place at the right time, not the battle necessarily, but when the artist was in Gettysburg. And then finally, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, which is going to block, as you can see, Jeb Stuart's attack on the rear of the Union Center on the afternoon of July 3rd. Now, this story, as you well know, George Custer takes command literally days before. So on the evening of June 29th, on the road between Emmitsburg, Maryland, and Littleton, Pennsylvania, a fairly distraught Lieutenant Samuel Harris, riding a distance behind his regiment. He'd been in uniform for about a year and only now in his first campaign, but he was a man without a unit. He had been relieved of his duties in the 5th Michigan Cavalry until an inquiry could determine if he had been negligent on picket duty. In the meantime, he had been ordered to stay out of the way. Suddenly, Harris was stopped dead in his tracks by the most fantastically dressed officer he had ever seen in his brief military career. Attired in all black with lots of gold braid and golden curls under a big, wide brimmed hat, waving along like little guidons as he rode, unquote. The officer approached Harris, paused long enough to ask the location of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Harris pointed down the road, and he wrote later, watched in disbelief as this energized cavalier and his escort, which include 2 buglers, hurriedly galloped off in a cloud of dust. Well, he had met George Custer, Brigadier General George Custer. Now, there are some winners and losers in all of this story, and certainly Custer is a winner. But Michigan's cavalry story began shortly after the Battle of First Bull Run. A Colonel Thornton Flemington Broadhead took the initiative of forming the 1st Michigan Volunteer Cavalry. Okay. Now, the 1st Michigan will see some action during the course of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. It's more detailed than we want to go into. Colonel Broadhead will actually be killed at the Battle of Second Bull Run. As Broadhead's men gain some valuable experience, Michigan will muster other regiments of cavalry, the 5th and the 6th in particular. They will reach the nation's capital in late 1862. And shortly after the cavalrymen arrived, the congressman, Francis Kellogg, you're looking at him right there on the right, took the regiment's officers to visit the White House to meet President Lincoln. After introductions and small talk, the entourage prepared to leave when Kellogg, and like a good politician, boldly declared, "Mr. President, these are the officers of a regiment of cavalry who have come from my state of Michigan. They are Wolverines and are on the track of Jeb Stuart, whom they propose to pursue and capture if there is any virtue in a name," unquote. Well, the very glib, probably tired Abraham Lincoln nonchalantly responded, "Gentlemen, I can assure you that it would give me much greater pleasure to see Jeb Stuart in captivity than it has given me to see you." Well, by early 1863, the 7th Michigan Cavalry arrived in Washington, and the 5th, 6th, and 7th were put under the command of General Joseph Copeland. Again, on your slide, a retired judge from Pontiac. Copeland had entered the war as a lieutenant colonel of the 1st Michigan Cavalry and then led the 1st Michigan Cavalry. Again, his regiments didn't really do a whole lot in Northern Virginia, kind of chasing Confederate guerrillas in the early months of 1863, in the spring of 63, chasing John Mosby, as it turns out. Days of June of 1863, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, those 3 regiments, 5th, 6th, and 7th, will enter Maryland, fording the mile-wide Potomac River at Edwards Ferry on a moonless night. As one trooper remembered, the only guide to the proper course was to follow those in advance. But as the horse succeeded horse, they were gradually borne farther and farther down the stream, away from the ford into deeper water. Well, nobody drowned, as it turns out, but they did arrive. And as the days neared the battle, the horses were well fed and groomed, the haversacks were replenished, and the 5th and the 6th will move north along the Emmitsburg Pike. This is before the battle now, entering Gettysburg, the first Union troops to do so. Church bells ringing out a joyous peal, according to one cavalryman. Enthusiastic residents turning out, according to one resident, to see so many of our own men, unquote. Now, the dirty, mean-looking rebels, as they pointed out, had already passed through the town. So what we've got are masses of smiling faces filling the streets, according to one Michiganian. Men stood with pails of water and distributed sandwiches, while, this Michiganian pointed out, bevies of women and girls handed out bouquets of flowers, decorating both man and beast. One trooper fondly recalled a young lady standing in the door singing the Star-Spangled Banner as loudly as she could sing. Veteran Lieutenant Colonel Russell Alger claimed that he had never experienced such a demonstration of joy during the course of his wartime experience. Now, from Gettysburg, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade commander, General Copeland, reported an estimated 2,000 rebels with artillery had passed through a few days earlier. At the same time, he estimated that there were 6,000 Southerners with more cannon north of the town. He dispatched couriers to share the valuable intelligence with higher command. That evening now, this is a couple days before the fight starts, the horse soldiers were camped outside a town where the soldiers, one horseman remembered, were up to their knees in clover, okay? Well, it was a good experience while they were there, but then they were forced to leave, as it turns out. And as they were marching out of Gettysburg, along came word that Copeland had been replaced. He had been replaced by George Custer. Now, Custer was born in Ohio, graduated from West Point, last in his class, as it turns out. Subsequent appointments had been unimpressive until the June of 1863. He, again, had come to the attention of high command. George McClellan had selected him as an aide-de-camp, as it turns out. But it was General Alfred Pleasanton, newly appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac Cavalry Command, who decided he wanted some officers with proper dash to command cavalry. Pleasanton received permission to promote Custer and 2 other captains, Michigan native Elon Farnsworth and Wesley Merritt, to the rank of brigadier general. They skipped, as you know, several grades in the process. Custer, curiously enough, had tried to get a colonelcy with one of the Michigan regiments. Now he commanded the entire Michigan Cavalry Brigade, which, by the way, included not just the 5th, 6th, and 7th, as we well know, but now the 1st Michigan as well. As for, let me go back here to General Copeland real quickly. He suddenly lost his job. Matter of fact, he labeled it an indignity and a disgrace. He protested to General Pleasanton, who said, "You're 50 years old, you're too old." Ultimately, General Copeland went and never commanded troops in battle again, and he went to the rear, as it turns out. Okay. Well, as for Custer, and there is the command and the events that take place, you have seen here some of the fights that take place in places like Hanover, as Stuart is making his way back towards Gettysburg, as it turns out. This painting, I should have started before I introduced it, is Lieutenant Charles Storrs. Storrs is from Grand Rapids. He will surprise General Wade Hampton's brigade early in the fighting. Now, this is the second day near Hunterstown. But earlier in the fighting, James Parsons, a 25-year-old from Grand Rapids, found himself engaged in a personal firefight with Hampton at a distance of about 125 yards. When Parsons' weapon fouled, he raised his hand, apparently seeking time to clear the bore. Hampton nodded his approval and waited patiently. When the contest resumed, the South Carolinian came out the winner because Parsons was wounded and forced to flee. Though again, in this painting, Lieutenant Storrs closed on Hampton, striking the brigadier with his saber. Miraculously, the general avoided any serious injury and took after his assailant. A faulty percussion cap in Hampton's pistol and a fairly speedy Yankee horse saved Storrs from any injury or capture. But again, Trobriand's got us a great painting, as it turns out. Well, fighting at Hanover and Hunterstown and the like all bring us to what takes place on the fight at Rummel's Farm late afternoon on the 3rd. The Michigan Cavalry Brigade has been on the move for several days. And as it turns out, the fight here has Colonel Russell Alger's 5th Michigan Cavalry will start the fight, and then Custer, who is always in front of his troops, "Come on, you Wolverines," leading the 7th Michigan at one point. Again, a regiment that had never seen the fight before. And then ultimately, the 7th Michigan crashing into a fence, as it were, a desperate situation. They had blunted the first rebel assault, as it turns out. There is a lull in the fight, and then the Confederates will send 8 regiments strong. Now, they're not full regiments by any stretch, but with their sabers glistening, according to Captain James Kidd, recalling the rebel advance, quote, as an inspiring and imposing spectacle that brought a thrill to the hearts of spectators. He could write this well after the war because he knows how it's going to play out. The Southerners moved fairly ponderously at first, and then Federal cannoneers firing long range and then some double-shotted canister are slowing down the Confederate advance, as it were. And then again, here comes Custer, as it turns out, across this field right here, leading the 1st Michigan. At one point, there was a concern on the part of one Michiganian that we would be swallowed up. Well, with every man yelling like a demon, the 1st Michigan rushed on, Custer leader boasting, quote, "They advanced to the charge of a vastly superior force with as much order and precision as if going on parade." Lieutenant Colonel Alger watched the most gallant charge of the war. And again, as you read about this, the 2 columns approaching nearer and nearer and then crashing into each other. This again is the monument engraving, which I'll show you here in a second. There's the monument, and you can see what Russell Alger had to say in those, for about 10 minutes, apparently, the struggle raged with unmitigated fury, and then the rebels began to back away, retreat. They had stopped Stuart's Invincibles in a straight-up cavalry fight, despite being outnumbered at least 2-1. Now, the Michigan Cavalry Brigade report 250 casualties, about 90% of the Yankee losses at the fight at Rommel's farm. How important was the Michigan Cavalry Brigade that day? Well, no surprise that George Custer will write, or Crow is a better way to put it, I challenge the annals of warfare to produce a more brilliant or successful charge of cavalry. Michigan Cavalry Brigade historian Edward Longacres does admit Stuart's legions had been battered, but not broken. Nonetheless, this day they had been repulsed, largely as a result of two of the most dramatic charges of this or any other war. The one in particular, cavalryman talked about wanting to wear a red necktie like Custer, and pretty much the brigade began to sport those red neckties, which they, according to Leslie's Illustrated Magazine, to characterize as a symbol of bravado in a challenge to combat. There is one other story about a Michiganian, Elon Farnsworth. This was a disastrous charge late on the third day of the fight as well. Farnsworth, again, one of the captains promoted to brigadier general, given a command to take his troopers and attack entrenched infantrymen. It was a suicidal effort. His brigade commander, Judson Kilpatrick, should have been held up on charges as a result of this. He was not, as it turns out. Farnsworth's death becomes kind of a footnote, ultimately, in the end of the fight. So, a turning point. We have to always remind my students that not 50,000 killed, but 50,000 casualties. Okay. Private Edgar Clark of Michigan will concede shortly after the battle, we have been through some tough times. However, this 3rd Michigan infantryman concluded, it makes a good deal of difference if we attack them or they attack us. Colonel Morrow, the 24th Michigan, concurred, reporting during his brief imprisonment that distinguished, his words now, distinguished rebel officers spoke in terms of admiration of the conduct of our troops. And Morrow even heard that the rebel corps commander, A.P. Hill, claimed, quote, he had never known the rebels, or excuse me, he had never known the Federals to fight so well. Henry Matreau from Berrien County in the southwestern part of the state, serving in the Iron Brigade, summed up the thoughts of many on both sides when he said, quote, a man that went through the carnage unhurt may call himself a lucky man. Well, as for the carnage, of those 4,000 Michiganians, 1 in 4 are left to casualties, okay? Matreau was fortunate. Lieutenant Charles Salter, the 16th Michigan, was fortunate. Matter of fact, he would ponder awarding, you know, as he was reading the newspapers, all the credit was being given to the generals. And he took exception with that, as you can see here. I contend it was the Army of the Potomac that won the battle and not General Meade. We are not fighting for generals, this young Detroiter affirmed, but for our country. And I hope that Northern people someday will give the credit of our fighting to the soldiers and not to make such gods of the generals. Well, victory was sweet, but the reality is that there was plenty of sorrow. And as you can see here, 171 bodies. There was some optimism. Again, the Reverend of the 1st Michigan Infantry said, the victory is complete and our hearts are full of gladness. Or a private serving in the 5th Michigan Cavalry predicted the South will be subdued within 3 months. Well, and he and his fellow cavalrymen would be able to go home to live a peaceful and happy life. That was not to be. In his case, he didn't go home either. After the formal ceremonies of the Michigan Day in 1889, veterans and guests reminisced at their respective monuments. They placed a small American flag and Michigan flowers on each grave in the National Cemetery. The solemn task was made even more touching by messages accompanying the floral bouquets that read, place this upon my grandpa's grave, I never saw him. Or, from my brother's grave, he was killed by my side. Or, in memory of my dear boy, his mother. Earlier in the day, the keynote speaker, Luther Trowbridge, had concluded, quote, long after we have passed away, these silent monuments, dumb and speechless though they may be, shall proclaim the deep and lasting gratitude of a great people to their heroic dead. Well, dumb and speechless seems kind of harsh to me. But these granite memorials stand as reminders of the sacrifices made by thousands of Michiganians, both men and women, to end the dreadful institution of slavery and guarantee, as President Lincoln reminded Americans in November of 1863, this government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The end.
Thank you, Roger. Everybody can unmute themselves to ask questions, but before we do that, let me stop the recording because I don't think we want to record people asking zillions of questions. So give me a second here to find my buttons and figure out what to do. Okay.